Hello everyone, today I will show you how to paint this succulent plant in watercolors in a realistic botanical style. I will be using the new agave paper by Hahnemühle. This paper comes from their new range called Natural Line. This paper is made from 70% agave fiber and 30% cotton. So let's see how it behaves. I'm going to try to replicate this plant here on the right hand side, but I might change the colors. I might make my second plant a little bit more blue than green. So the supplies you'll need, of course, is a pad of paper. I'm going to be using full pan watercolors by the White Knights, but I also have a foldable mixing palette here to the side, just so I have a few more colors and also more mixing space. But you're more than welcome to use any watercolors that you have. It's very important to have at least 2 jars of water next to you. I actually prefer to have 3 or 4, just so I have more room to mix clean and crisp colors. And I will show you how to get those really saturated and clean mixes. I will be using my synthetic round brushes by Botanical. As you can see, I have 3 different sizes here. I have a large brush, which is going to enable me to pick up colors from my palettes and also lay out the initial washes for my plant. Then I have a smaller brush, which will be good for adding some details. And then the tiny brush is what I call the detail brush, and that will be very useful for going into like the very, very intricate details in our plant. This will be predominantly used at the very end when I'm adding the finishing touches. I will be using a soft blackwing pencil to make my watercolor sketch. You don't have to use the same one, of course, but it's important that your pencil is rather soft, just so you don't damage the delicate surface of your watercolor paper. Please make sure you have some kitchen towel next to you. This will be used to get rid of excess water, excess pigment from your brushes. I also prepared a piece of paper that I won't be using for painting anymore. This will be very useful for checking our color mixes. And last but not least, if you feel like you want to have a little bit more space to mix your colors, I recommend using a ceramic dish. Here I have a dish with some compartments, which is very useful, but you can use a dinner plate as well. Ceramic dishes in general are very good for mixing watercolors because they're smooth and very easy to clean. The Agave watercolor paper by Hahnemühle is the new paper in the Natural Line range of art supplies by Hahnemühle, and it's an amazing, affordable pad of watercolor paper, great for beginners, great for practice. So before we dive into painting our succulents, I would like to just go through the basic techniques and just see how this paper reacts to the wet and wet, how it reacts to layering. First of all, let's take a look at how this paper reacts to the wet and wet technique, which is the most common technique in watercolor painting. I'm going to put a clean layer of water . Just make a shape, it can be any shape you like. I'm going to make it into a rectangle just so it's a little bit easier to see the gradient. Let me grab my first color. And I transfer a little bit of it onto my palette just so I can adjust the consistency of my mix. And now I will touch the surface of the agave paper and just watch the paint explode. As you can see, the explosion effect is really amazing on this paper. I think the fibers of this paper really lend themselves to the textures of the pigment just being pulled down, and it's really soothing to watch. Now let me switch to green color. And I'm going to pick up some of this blue again and see what happens when I merge 2 colors together. I'm going to get rid of this pigment from my brush and add another more transparent circle next to it. You can see this paper is really responsive to the wet and wet technique, and therefore I think it's an amazing paper to experiment with. Let's drop in a little bit of magenta in there. I think doing exercises like these is really invaluable. It really teaches you about the surface that you're dealing with. I really encourage you to just experiment and see how a certain paper reacts to those basic techniques. Now let's see how the paper reacts when we're layering. Layering is a technique of putting multiple layers of pigment on top of each other. We usually do that once the first layer is dry. I'm going to make some kind of a shape here. And I'm going to let this dry in order to show you what happens when I put another layer of the same color on top. So the first layer of this blue square is now dry. You might notice an interesting kind of streaky texture of the paper. You can really see the direction of the brush as I was pulling the pigment in specific directions. This is definitely interesting. I don't think I've encountered this kind of a texture before, but I would like to show you what happens when you put another layer of color down. So I'm going to grab a little bit more of the same blue ultramarine. It is important to wait for the first layer to dry before you go in with the second one. Just putting another wet layer on top of a dry layer, it just means that I can get more of an even layer. So I'm going to wait for this to dry and let's see what happens. As we're waiting for the second layer here to dry fully, let me show you how to lift watercolors. Lifting is a very useful technique. You will end up using it a lot when you're painting with watercolors. I'm going to paint an oval shape. Again, nothing too specific. I like to demonstrate these techniques on simple shapes just because then it's easier to show you what I'm actually doing. And it looks a little bit flat. There's no dimension to it. What you can do is get rid of this pigment in your dirty jar, and I'm going to pat dry my brush on the kitchen towel. I'm just getting rid of excess moisture. Let's imagine that the light source for this object is coming in from the right hand side, from the top. Using the tip of the brush and then pressing down a little bit more, picking up some of this excess pigment, and I'm uncovering the remains of the original whiteness of the paper surface. Now you can only do this technique when your object is still wet. If it's dried, then it's not really much you can do. You can't lift the color anymore. So sometimes in watercolors you have to act fairly quickly. Depending on how much pressure you put on your brush right now, the more pigment you're going to be able to pick up. This takes a little bit of practice. And of course I'm giving you a very quick overview, but we will be doing a little bit of lifting today as well. Build your contrast and highlights this way. Let's go back to our layering. The second part is dry as well, and notice how much more saturated the bottom half of this square is. So let me just quickly try and go in with the third layer. I wouldn't suggest using more than 3 layers. Sometimes you can get away with 4. I tend to use less and less water each layer. But if you're using too many layers, you are risking damaging the delicate surface of your watercolor papers. But just notice how much more saturated and deep this blue ultramarine has become. The best tip for watercolors is to paint from light values and move on to the darkest ones. If you start with really delicate pale layers, then you can move on to more saturated hues as you're moving forward and as you're adding more layers. As you can see with the first layer, when it was wet, it was quite vibrant blue. When it dried, it became a little bit more flat, and this is normal with watercolors. Once the water evaporates, the color will become a little bit more toned down, and you will see that in action when we're painting our succulent today. Now I'd like to show you how to remove an individual sheet of paper from a paper pad. So the Agave paper pad, as a lot of other pads, is glued on all 4 sides, and therefore you might be wondering, how do I get rid of this single sheet of paper without ripping everything apart? You will notice that there is a little gap in between the sheets on this side. You can lift this sheet individually just on this side. So what you can do is use a bone folder. I have a bone folder by Hahnemühle here. It is made from bamboo. Just try to wiggle the bone folder in between the sheets here and gently start pulling and pushing to the sides. So you have to do it fairly gently.
And now the sheet is removed from the pad, and there's also no marks and no scratches on the remaining sheets.
Let's start with a pencil sketch of our plant. As you can see, this plant has got quite a lot of layers, and anytime I encounter a subject that seems quite complicated in the structure, I try to simplify the shape and just kind of determine what the main shapes of my subject are. I will try to replicate this shape, and you can use this image as a reference for yourself as well. So the main shape that I notice is a circle. It's not going to be a perfect circle. We can kind of get away with a little bit of an uneven shape, but I'm going to go in and sketch a circle first. And as you can see, the sketch is very light. I do this intentionally because watercolor is a transparent medium. And even though we're going to be building up some of the shadow areas, it would be very easy for us to see the pencil lines underneath the watercolor layers. Just try to keep your hand really light and put hardly any pressure on the paper. The second thing I'm going to do is go into the very middle of the plant. This circular shape is pretty much bang on in the middle of the plant I will be drawing. So I'll just try to make a little reference point. And now what we have to do is pretty much just add the shapes of the individual leaves of our succulent. Personally, I find it easier to go from the middle and outwards in a kind of spiral movement, so then it's a little bit easier for me to keep the proportions. I think if I started with the outer leaves, it would be a little bit more difficult to understand how big the leaves in the middle should be. So I'm going to start from the middle, and the very middle of the plant is going to be basically just a few kind of C-shaped lines, like so, just trying to replicate those seed-like shapes. This doesn't have to be very precise. We'll mostly be working with the watercolor in order to get the shadow and contrasts in order. And then I move on to the further outlines. So I can see that there is a little leaf that stands out like so. It's going to be kind of vertically placed. So I'll just outline this whole shape. It's going to be kind of like a triangle or a bit like an arrow shape. And I'm going to place them all around the center of the plant. And then basically I move on outwards and I repeat the same process, but I try to keep the middle of each leaf at the point where the two previous leaves are meeting on their sides. I am now in a good place to sketch out the bigger leaves and start going outwards into the very middle. So now I'm going to make those shapes larger. Bear in mind, I'm not replicating this plant identically, so some of the leaves will be placed a little bit differently than in my reference picture. So now I've sketched the middle leaves and I'm going to go into the bigger ones. The moment you go into the bigger leaves, they start being a little bit more rounded on the edges. Now I'm sketching out these leaves. They are basically very much rounded on the sides, and then they become narrower as they come into the center. Now you'll notice that sometimes when I'm sketching, my pencil lines are a little bit harder, but that's okay because I can remove them with an eraser. Okay, so the sketch is now ready. So I'm removing some of the harder lines. I'm also removing the main outline of the circle that I initially laid down just to guide myself. So I'm definitely removing the circle. And I'm also going around some of the pencil lines which are a little bit too hard because I don't want them to be visible underneath watercolor. Now at the same time, I don't want to remove too much of the sketch because there's quite a lot of layers in it, and I think I would get a little bit lost in the layers and where the leaves should be placed if I removed too much of my sketch. So try not to overdo it. You kind of want the sketch to be light and still visible to your own eyes. Okay, so the sketch is ready. I'm going to put this to the side now and we're going to move on and mix some colors. Okay, now is the time to pre-mix some colors just so that when we're in the middle of the painting, we already have our base of colors laid out and it will be a smooth process that way. I mentioned that I will be making a similar illustration to this succulent, but I will try to paint it in more of a blue shade. So this one is heavily green. I will try to tweak it a little bit and make this one a little bit more blue. And also the yellow parts that you see on the edges of the leaves here, I'll try to make those a little bit closer to lime green. I'm going to put my paper away just so that I don't splatter some colors on it whilst I'm mixing. And I'm going to have my scrap paper here so I can test the colors as I'm mixing them. First of all, let me show you how to mix clean colors and how to use your 2 jars of water in order to get clean, clear mixes and avoid mixing muddy colors. So I'm going to grab my bigger brush, and first of all I'm going to have to put some water on it just so it's nice and moist, and it's going to be easier to pick up color with a wet brush. So I'm swirling around and then tapping the brush against the side, and I'm going to grab some of this blue. And what I do, I usually load my brush up with this color just so I have a lot of saturation of the pigment on the brush. You can see that's loaded up with color. I'm going to transfer it to my palette. And now I need to make sure that the consistency is correct. If you use a lot of pigment, you're not going to have that much of a good flow on the brush. So I'm going to grab a tiny bit of water. I'm just literally dunking the tip of the brush in the jar and adding some water. And the consistency I would describe as kind of in between watery and buttery. So it's like a really creamy consistency. So now I'm going to check this color. The first strokes you're going to make are the most saturated this color will go. So this is a very dark blue, and this is going to be the most saturated version of this color. And now I'm going to add a little bit of water on my brush. And by adding more water, I'm diluting the color. So basically by adding more water from the left to the right, I'm achieving a much more transparent mix of blue. And at this point, this is the most saturated this blue will be, and this will be the most transparent this blue will be. Now this is important because this is how you build gradients, and that's how you control the saturation of your watercolors. And also this is a way to build contrast, highlights, and kind of have control over the light value of your paintings. Now let's say I would like to mix in another color. I would like to switch from blue to yellow. I'm going to call this jar the dirty jar because I'm going to be getting rid of all of my pigments in this one. So I'm getting rid of this blue pigment here, but there is a chance that I still have some blue residue on my brush. You can see there is like still a little bit of blue here because the water is blue. So now in order to have a clean brush again, I have to swirl it around in the clean jar. And that way I made sure that my brush is loaded up with clean water. So if you'll take a look now, there is hardly any residue of blue, or maybe just a tiny bit, but not much at all. And now I'm good to go and mix another color, which will be quite different to the blue. Let's say I'm gonna pick up a bit of this cadmium yellow, and I will still use the dirty water just to dilute this yellow a little bit. If you only use a tiny bit of this water, it shouldn't contaminate your yellow, although you do have to. This is also another reason why it would be useful to have more than 2 jars. But since we're painting a succulent and the main colors we'll be using will be blues, greens and yellows, we can get away with using this water to mix our yellows, even though it might contaminate the yellow a little bit with the blue. So you kind of have to determine what color palette you're going for, and that's how you're going to determine how you're going to use your water jars. But now I'm switching to green. And again, I'm just adding more water to dilute this green just to see what the value scale of this color is. And I have 3 separate colors because I used 2 jars to make sure that I mix clean, really nice colors, and they're separate. So this is the way to do it, by using at least 2 jars of water, making sure that my colors are clean. Okay, let's make some colors for the actual plant. As I said, try to make the green a little bit more blue. So I will still use green in my mixes, but I will just add much more blue to it. If you're mixing a dark color like this in your palette, it might be really difficult to see the colors you're mixing, so I'm just going to test them here. Now I got this really dark green. It's kind of like a bluish green. I think I might add a little bit more blue to it. Any blue kind of similar to ultramarine will work quite well. There we go. I think this is going to be the colors I'll be focusing on. So kind of like a very succulent, ocean-like colors. Please note that I have my kitchen towel here on the side. So whenever I pick up more color and then use a little bit more water to dilute the color, in order to get rid of excess water, excess pigment, I just tap my brush on the kitchen towel. So I'm going to have to probably add more of this color as I go along because I will inevitably run out as I'm painting the whole plant. But that's okay because I know which colors I mixed. There were these two blues over here and then my dark green. Okay. I want to mix a little bit of a lime green. So I'm going to grab a bit of this green that I have in this palette and mix it with the yellow that I already have here. And I got this really beautiful light green, although I think I might add a tiny bit more yellow to it. I would still like it to be closer to yellow than green. Something like cadmium yellow or Indian yellow will work really well here. This is Indian yellow I'm adding right now. And I think this is the right color. So essentially I'll be working with these two colors, just putting them next to each other so you can see. This is going to be like the highlights area of my plant, the lime green, and then this bluish or this greenish blue will be the main body of the succulent. The first step in the illustration is to lay down the first wash of color. I'm going to start with the lightest color. So in my instance, it will be the edges of the plant. As I said, the edges will be kind of this lime green that we have mixed. Now I have to be careful and make this mix quite watery, fairly transparent. I don't want this color to be very saturated at this point. The important thing to remember is that you should start with light colors in watercolors and then move on to the darker ones. This will prevent you from making any kind of radical movements. So I'm going to use a very diluted version of this lime green and I'm going to cover the entire area of this plant, of my sketch, with this light lime green color. So the first wash is just giving me kind of like a base and it will provide me with a sort of foundation for the whole color scheme of the illustration. Try not using too much water in here. You have to have a good ratio of water to pigment. You don't want to have puddles of water because then the paper will start buckling up and it will be very difficult for you to control the movement of water. So it's just like a thin layer of water. If I put it against the window light, you'll see that you can still see the texture of the paper underneath this layer. So this is the amount of water we're after, so you can still see the texture of the paper underneath the layer of water. Now I'm adding little drops of slightly more saturated here and there. I kind of want to just have a bit of diversity in the way I'm placing this first layer. Now when you have laid down your first layer and the layer of color is still quite transparent, you can still go around and remove some of the harder pencil lines. The reason I would do that is because I now notice that some of the lines that I've left are still a little bit too dark and they would still perhaps be visible once I start putting more layers of watercolor. So in order to do that, you can still go around and remove some of the harder lines. Now you'll still be able to detect where to put the correct colors because now that we have the first layer laid down, we kind of indicated the shapes and the direction of the petals. So I don't necessarily need the hard pencil lines to help me indicate that anymore. So I'm just going around and very gently removing some of the harder pencil lines. Okay, now that I have a clean, beautiful sketch and my first layer laid down, I can move on to adding more shadows and further layers. The next step is to add slightly more of this lime green and a bit more of a saturated concentration onto the outlines of my succulent leaves. So as you can see, the lightest parts of this succulent are on the very tips of those leaves. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add slightly more saturated version of this lime green on just the edges. And then also it will be easier for me to navigate the whole illustration because I will have those borders laid down. I'm going to use a smaller brush for this. Pick up some of my lime green that I've mixed. And that way I'm just indicating the edges of those leaves, the arrow shapes. I'm making the arrows a little bit thicker at the very tips. And you will see the benefit of putting this down even more once we go in with the darker colors for the body of the leaves. The light lime green will really stand against the darker colors and will create contrast, it will create depth. What it also does is that I'm sketching out the outlines of the individual leaves with the paintbrush, and therefore the pencil lines will not be needed anymore, and I won't have to have those harder pencil lines visible in order to remember where my borders are. Now that the lime outlines have dried up, I'm going to go in with the first wash of my green blue. So I'm loading up my brush with clean water again, and I'm taking some of this color. Now mind you that this color is very saturated, it's quite dark, and for the first layer of this color we don't want it to be very opaque. So I'm going to dilute a bit of this color, add some more water to this mix, make it more transparent, and now this can be my first layer. This is why it's important and useful to have multiple mixing palettes, just so you have a bit more room to mix different shades of colors. So I'm going to stick with the bigger brush for now. I'm going to try to be quite careful. It comes up to a sharp point. So right now I'm not necessarily too worried about building the shadow just yet. I will try to have more or less a kind of even, fairly pale wash of this bluish green. And I'm just covering up the area of my leaves, leaving the lime outlines free of this color. So I'm painting around those outlines. Note that I have my kitchen towel here next to me, and this enables me to keep control of the amount of water I'm placing and also the amount of pigment I'm laying down. Now this is of course quite a repetitive process because you do have to take this kind of illustration in stages. There's a lot of repetitive shapes, so all of the leaves are pretty much the same and you have to treat them the same way, which means that you might spend quite a bit of time going around the whole shape and just laying down the washes individually. So it's not a quick illustration, it's not one of those when you can just paint it and move on to the next one in 20 minutes. This certainly takes a little bit of time, but believe me, it is very rewarding at the end when you are laying down the final details, when you see everything coming together. Of course, you do have to be quite interested in botanical illustration, so if that's not necessarily your niche, this kind of illustration might not be your cup of tea. Although I do believe that it's very important to practice different styles of painting. Even if you think that this might not be for you, I think it's probably just going to expand your idea of what you can do with watercolors, how you can approach illustration. So I'm using the bigger brush to cover the bigger leaves with it. I do have to be fairly to only put the color down in the empty spaces and not on the outlines. So as I go towards the middle, I might have to switch to my smaller brush. I'm able to put a little bit more of a saturated color into these tiny triangles because I know that they will be the areas, like in this illustration, when they're at the darkest. They will be the spots which are in the most shadow. So you can also envision these things and you kind of think about it beforehand. So you're laying down the foundations for further layers that way. Sometimes I need to lift the color because maybe I have put down a little bit water or too much pigment, so I can dry my brush on the kitchen towel and then go over the wet area with dry brush and lift up some of the excess water, excess pigment. Now I'm going to switch to the smaller brush just to get into the little details in the middle of the plant. Now at this point, when you're working with such tiny details, it's a little bit easier to get lost within the shapes and forget where you're meant to be putting down the correct colors. But to be honest, I kind of just wing it. I try to make the shapes as small as possible. I'm going to use a smaller brush just to make those little triangles I mentioned a minute ago a little bit darker. This will be my indication these are the darkest spots. Now let's move on to the second layers. So as you can see, these leaves in the original illustration, they're gradually going from darker to lighter as they're going outwards to the tips of the leaves. That's what we're going to try to build up in the second layer. This won't be the end of the illustration just yet, but we need to start building up the shadow areas and the gradients. I'm going to be still using the same color as I mixed before, which is my base green and blue mixture. And if I run out of this color at any point, I can just mix a little bit more. I'm going to use a smaller brush for this. It will be a little bit easier for me to control my movements with a smaller brush. So I'm loading up my brush with quite a generous amount of this dark color, and I can start at any point I want. I think I'm just going to start here at this little leaf. And I'm putting really saturated dark mix of this color at the bottom of the leaf. I'm kind of going from the top to the bottom here in this shape. Now I'm going to quickly grab a little bit of water on the tip of my brush just to dilute this mixture a little bit. By adding a bit more water to my brush, I'm able to get a more transparent layer. Doing this again, getting more water on my brush. So each time I make a subsequent layer going towards the outer side of my leaf, I'm making the color more transparent. Now this kind of gradient is important in order to preserve the highlights and to build the gradual transition into the darker areas. If you feel like maybe there's a little bit too much color at a certain part, you can lift that color up with a drier brush, as before. Dry a brush on the kitchen towel and just go lightly on the surface, trying to pick up some of the excess pigment. We're trying to achieve kind of like a gradual change from a lighter to a darker color. And I'm going to repeat the same process for the rest of the leaves. Having this really dark mix of blue-green makes it really stand out against the yellow parts as well. So anytime you put a darker color next to a brighter one, you're going to create a punch. As you can see with my wet brush, I'm kind of pushing the pigment around a little bit. I'm able to control more or less where the pigment is going to go. I can push the dark pigment to be at the bottom of the leaf here. So I'm always taking up a little bit of water on the tip of my brush. Not getting rid of all of the pigment from the brush just yet. I just want a tiny bit more, just so I can dilute this color gradually. This does take a little bit of time to get used to. If you use too much water, you might find that you start creating puddles on your paper, which is not ideal because puddles dry up really unevenly. One thing you will notice is that when watercolors dry, they start looking paler and less kind of juicy, less saturated than when they're wet. This is of course because, when something is wet, the translucency of water and the shine of the layer of the water will make everything look a little bit more vibrant. When that water evaporates as the watercolor layers dry, inevitably your colors will look a little bit more dull and a little bit more toned down. That's why we work in layers, and you will see when we move on to the further layers to add even more contrast and more detail. That's when we're going to get the really darker shadows and the really deep colors. So don't worry if at this stage you feel like the colors you're putting down are looking a little bit dull, because that's absolutely normal and that will happen, which is why botanical illustration requires quite a bit of patience to kind of see through those stages where you feel like things are not going very well. But you just have to trust the process, and you have to have the resilience to wait and just see that the more you work on it, the more you're able to achieve those like really deep and rich colors. Now you might notice that some of the gradients that I'm making on the individual leaves are not precisely gradual. There is some bumps here and there. They're not exactly the same. And that's because botanical illustration allows you to have a little bit more flexibility. As I mentioned in the beginning, not every plant looks the same. There's probably not two plants exactly the same. There's always room to experiment with the shapes a little bit, as long as you keep the general proportions correct and the general kind of color scheme accurate. Then you can really get away with certain imperfections here and there. You know, certain plants will be a little bit wonky. Some of the leaves are maybe a little bit rotten. You know, you can kind of think about incorporating a little bit of this irregularity, something that will not be very predictable. Now I have to mix in a little bit more of this color because I ran out. Every time I have to mix a little bit more of a color, I test it on my test sheet to make sure that it's definitely the correct shade. Just a few more leaves to go. I personally never get bored of this. As I said, it's a very relaxing thing to be doing. So if you're into kind of mindfulness and repetitive tasks like this, I think this could be perfect for you. I consider this to be like, you know, art therapy. It's just so relaxing, and I really get so lost in my paintbrush and the paper. But also having the physical, the tangible relationship between my hand and the paper allows me to really be very present. The closer you get to finishing this layer, the more you start noticing the depth of the illustration. Of course, we'll still need to add more contrast, more details and textures, but because of the stark difference between the darker colors that I'm laying down right now against the limey yellow-green tips of the leaves, we're getting this really nice punch of colors. You can see that I'm constantly moving back and forth between my palette, my water jar, and then my kitchen towel as well. So you start developing this muscle memory after you've painted for a while. You start noticing that your hand is basically just moving on its own back and forth between the paper and the jar and the kitchen towel. Okay, so for the last middle bits, I'm going to switch to my tiny brush. This is my detail brush. It'll be very good for reaching the really tiny little elements and little corners in the middle of the plant. Okay, so the first layer is finished. It already looks much more dimensional. You can see that there's underneath the layers of leaves, which gives us an illusion of depth, And we're just going to build up on that further. Before I move on to adding more contrast for the actual leaves with the dark green-blue color, I would like to go back to my lime borders of the leaves and add a little bit more punch to them because they're a little bit pale, they're a little bit flat. We can basically add a little bit more depth to them by adding some more saturation. I'm going to grab my mixing palette again and I'll use my bigger brush again. Generally using a bigger brush is much better for mixing colors. You can pick up much more pigment. Now notice that the first jar I was using, the dirty jar, is indeed very blue. So if I used this jar to mix lime green, I would probably contaminate that color quite a bit. So I'm going to now switch to the clean jar and use this jar to mix my yellowish tone. So I have a base of this color here. I can just activate this again by adding some more water to it. I'll go in, get a bit more of my Indian yellow. I'm going to go back to the smaller brush, the middle brush that I have. Load up my brush with this lime green, and I'm specifically going to put a more saturated version of this color kind of more on the borders of those leaves. That way I will leave the kind of lighter yellowish tone on the tips of the leaves, and these will be my highlights. The reason I'm doing this is because on the tips of the leaves there is normally more sunlight reaching that area. It just makes sense to keep the tip of the leaf a little bit lighter. That way we're going to be able to build contrast and build the depth. You build depth by working with shadows and highlights and the contrast that you get between those two. You can see that the borders of the leaves are gaining a bit of punch because I'm adding this quite vibrant mix of yellow and green. Okay, the next step in our step-by-step layering process is to add slightly more color to the sides of the plant. You will notice in the first image that the yellow outlines of the leaves are basically just at the top, and then as they go towards the center of the plant, as they go inwards, they kind of diminish and they just start blending with the green. I would like to achieve something similar here. Of course, I do like the outlines and they look very crisp when they are met with the darker green. However, I do feel like it's looking a little bit artificial. I like to keep the botanical look and kind of accuracy of shadows more or less. So what I'm going to do is just make some of the lines on the sides of the leaves a little bit darker just so they look a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to go use my base color for the leaves and I'm diluting it slightly just so it's not like super dark. We're layering this color over the lime green. Laying multiple colors on top of a certain area brings out more depth, but it also means that the color I'm putting on right now is going to merge with the color that's underneath. So the lime yellow in combination with this blue that I'm putting on right now will give me like a darker green, which should look quite natural for the sides of my leaves. So I'll just go around and repeat the process everywhere. Now is the time to go in with the third layer. I want to now focus on adding the contrast, the shadows, and really making it all pop. The really dark shadows that you can see in this illustration in between the leaves were added with layers and layers of watercolor. And the last layer is the most dense one. You can use less water, more paint in order to achieve this really dark value. But first of all, I need to mix in a little bit more color because as you can see, I ran out of my green blue. Now this time round I will add quite a bit of pigment. I'm going to make it really, really dense and dark because I will want to go in with a lot of pigment, not much water, and really create those shadow areas. What you can do is also add a tiny bit of black. Now some watercolorists I think will advise you against using black because in theory you can mix your blacks from red, yellow and blue, which are the primary colors. If you mix them together, you should be able to get something approximating a black color. But in order to make your life a little bit simpler, there's nothing wrong with using black straight from the pan or a tube. So I'm gonna go ahead and mix in a little bit of this ivory black that I have here. I'm using this mix of blue, green and black. And let's take a look and see what it looks like. It's a very dense, very dark blue. So this will work really well. It's a little bit darker than my previous mixes, so it should work really well for the shadows. And pick up a generous amount of this pigment. So I'm really loading up my brush with this color. And I'm going to start with the biggest leaves because it's a little bit easier to do it with this brush on the bigger leaves. When I move on to the really small leaves, I might have to switch to my detail brush. So basically I'm doing the same thing as I was doing with the second layer when I was just putting the darker color at the bottom of the leaf. But notice that this time around I'll be using much less water. So I'm putting a really dense value of color down on those leaves because I really want to build those shadow areas. I'm drying my brush on the kitchen towel as I go along. So the brush is actually, I would say, half wet, half dry. It's definitely not as wet as before. I'm actively trying to make the brush a little bit more dry. What this allows is building of texture. See the movements that I'm making here? I'm not actually going in like one sweeping movement with my brush from one side to the other, but I'm tapping. This allows me to build the texture of those leaves as well. So you'll notice that some of the little parts of the leaf I will actually leave blank. I won't necessarily put this wash of color on the entire area of the leaf. I will leave some of those gaps. And this means that I'm able to build this texture. This will be imitating the irregular textures that you find on plants, the little bumps, the little scratches. And for me, this is something that is really crucial in illustration, especially botanical illustration. Adding these final details, the textures, is what really makes the illustration pop. And in my mind, it's what makes it look realistic. So that's why I always try to go in layers. That's why there's so many steps to this, because in order to build this contrast and achieve those really dark shadows, you have to have layers of colors laid down as your foundation, and then you're building on top of that. With the third layer, the shadow area is definitely quite dark and potent. Notice that all the other leaves that only had 2 layers on them so far, they've all become quite pale. And this is due to what I was explaining earlier, that watercolor always goes a little bit paler whilst it's drying. That's why I paint in layers, just so I can build those colors up from the scratch. And putting intense color on top of already existing color just makes that color much more potent, much more saturated. So I'm still going to pick up a little bit of water onto my brush, mostly because I want to get rid of this intense pigment as I go towards the tip of the leaf. But I'm not using much water. I want my brush to be fairly dry at this point, just so I can get the texture out.
And now working on these layers, you can really see the contrast between the lighter outlines of those leaves and the darker blue values. So by working on these layers consistently, by carefully adding them and kind of having the patience to see it through, you will start noticing your piece becoming much more dimensional. As you're going through those quite repetitive processes of adding the layers and the details and the contrasts, I just want you to really try to focus on the paper in front of you. Just really be mindful of this moment that you're sharing with your paper. I know that sounds a little bit cheesy, but at the same time, for me, it's been a lifesaver because I spend a lot of time looking at screens. And I think there's just a lot of screen time in everyone's life these days. So having a moment to really just look at something tangible and really just focus on the paper and the paints in front of you is very good for your mental health and your physical health as well. Now that I'm reaching the smaller petals, I'm just going to quickly switch on to the detail brush and do the same process but with a smaller brush.
Okay, now that the main layers for the main body of the plant are done, you can really see the depth, you can see the contrast between the colors, the kind of 3D dimensionality that has been created with layers of watercolors and with controlling the saturation of our mixes of paints. Now what I would like to do is tweak the size of the leaves, the lime yellow colors a little bit, just so there's a little bit more punch to it, a little bit more saturation. As I mentioned, these pieces do require some patience. You will kind of keep going back and forth, attending to the same areas you worked on again and again, just to make sure that everything looks pretty much perfect. The only other thing at the end that I will try to do is probably add just tiny bit more of it, like literally just like single dots of dark blue color for some of the shadow areas. We'll see how we get on. It looks pretty good. I think the dimensionality is pretty much there already. I like how it's placed. You can see that it came out pretty different to the original. I intentionally wanted to make a piece that would be different, just so I'm not repeating myself entirely. And that way you can also use both of these paintings as a reference for your painting. Slightly different approach in terms of color and also the edges of the plant. These edges were much more blurred. The yellow was basically just at the tips. And then in this illustration, we have the edges much more visible, they're much more crisp. So, you know, there's little things that you can do to tweak those things and kind of make them a little bit more varied every time you paint. So I'm going to go back to my lime yellow. I might add a tiny bit more Indian yellow to this mix this time around, just so I can have a bit more diversity in the color that I'll be putting on. So again, I'm activating this color. Again, whenever it dries in your palette, just add a little bit of water and the color will be good to go again. Okay, I think this will do. A very nice, vibrant, limey yellow. So I'm going to use the detail brush for this. I think at this point, all of the areas that still need a little bit of tweaking are so small and so narrow that it's really best to use the smallest brush that you have. So as before, I'm going to start with the sides of the leaves. And as I go towards the tip of the leaf, I will try to dilute the color. So I'm still adding some more saturation to the whole edge, but as I go towards the tip, I still want to keep those highlights. The reason I'm doing this right now is because it's the last layer for my sides, and as you might have noticed, some of the sides became a little bit more dull as I was working on the body of the leaves with my blue greenish tones. The sides became a little bit dull. They kind of lost their vibrancy a little bit. Even though they stand out, they still, I thought, needed a little bit more of a kick of color. So as my last step for these edges, I'm just adding a little bit of this color. Now, keeping those highlights out and not covering the entire area of those side of the leaves with this green is very important, because in watercolors it's very important to be able to control the saturation of your paints, and you do that by adjusting how much water you're using and how much pigment you're using, and keeping those contrasts alive and like really paying attention to them in every little detail is really the magic trick in botanical illustration. It requires patience, it does require repetitive movements, but at the end of the day, it's what really elevates your illustrations and gives them the realistic quality. So it takes time, but it's really worth it. So I think the illustration is pretty much finished. You can definitely finish at this point. It looks good. There is dimensionality. There is a sense of depth. It definitely looks equally as deep as that illustration. However, me being myself, I'm a perfectionist and I love the details. So personally, I'm going to add just a little bit more of the dark color just for certain areas that I can see that could be a little bit darker, just to really bring out that depth. You really don't have to do this if you can't be bothered anymore. I absolutely understand it's a long process, but personally I do like to make sure that I've done everything top notch. So I'm going to go back to my dark blue. I'm actually going to grab a little bit more of that ivory black that I've added to my color before. Okay, so it's a really dark mix. I'm going to load up this tiny brush with loads of this dark pigment, and just certain areas which I want to be really, really dark, I'm just going to put a little bit more color on them. So I usually go into the very corners of my leaves. I'm not even going into the outer sides of the leaves anymore, just focusing on the corners. I find that somehow the corners tend to go pale as they dry, a little bit more than the rest of the surface of the leaves. I think maybe it's because the pigment is being pushed around a lot. So sometimes it doesn't condense at the edges where I would like it to condense. So going back to these little corners with my dark mix of color, I just ensure that I put another really dark layer on top of these areas which are a little bit too pale. I've spent so much time looking at this piece that I can really notice some of the areas that still need a tiny bit of tweaking. So that's just the curse of illustrations like these, you know? You notice all the little details. I do feel like I've done pretty well. I don't need to tweak that many details at this point. Most of the layers were laid out pretty evenly and pretty densely, so that these minor details I'm adding right now, small addition. The purpose of this tutorial is that you get a glimpse of my actual process. I'm really doing everything that I would normally do when I'm painting, so I just want you to get the most real account of how a botanical illustration like this is made. So I'm mixing a little bit more water into my base color. Don't want it to be too dark. And the same as before, I'm just adding a tiny bit more of this color on the very edges, the very corners of my lime yellow edges. I just felt like some of those have lost a little bit of their shadow. So especially in those areas where it's very dark, when the leaves are pretty much black, it's good to tweak that, and that way you ensure that the illustration looks realistic and that the light that reaches a certain part of an illustration is evenly spread. Okay, so the illustration is now done. Many layers and many tweaks later, and I'm finally happy with it. I love the depth of it. I like the shadow areas. It looks very much tangible. That's what I was going for. So I'm very happy with the result. You might notice there's little dots of little splashes of watercolor around. This doesn't really bother me. If you're painting in order to have an original painting which is pristine and clean, this might be an issue. You might want to practice having your workspace super tidy and being very careful not to make any marks. However, for myself, I normally would take this kind of illustrations, digitize it, edit it on my computer, so then I would get rid of the background and any marks like these. So that's the way I do it, and if you're interested in illustration to be used on products or any printed versions of them, then scanning and digitizing will be your savior. It's interesting to compare the two illustrations. They came out very differently. I actually didn't plan for them to be that different. I thought this illustration today would look more similar to this one. I think this one is a little bit smoother looking because of the edges. They are much more rounded, whereas here the edges are a little bit more pointy. But I love the difference in colors. I'm super happy with the fact that this is like warm greens, and here we have kind of like ocean blue colors. Both of the colors are absolutely suitable for succulent plants, and so I'm very happy with both. I just think it's interesting that every time you sit down to paint, and it happens to me all the time, that every time I paint a subject, it comes out a little bit different. So that's why it never gets boring. Watercolors are this endless source of inspiration for me because it's always something new that I can discover. There's a new approach that I develop every single time I sit down to paint. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Try to paint different subjects. Choose your favorite subjects, see what sticks with you, and try over and over again. And that's how you really develop your own style, your own approach to this, and obviously muscle memory and just an ease of using watercolors. So it's all about persistence and patience and just having fun with it.